look onto the front page of most newspapers these days, and you're likely to see stories on the conflagration in Hong Kong, or something on the current state of U.S.-China trade dispute. Maybe even go a few pages into that putative newspaper, and you'll come across a story maybe on North Korea, or on the Japanese economy, or on the South China Sea. For all of our domestic political preoccupations, there's a bigger world out there, and arguably the most important part of the world for the future, from an American perspective, is the Asian Pacific. Important things are happening there, but it's sometimes hard to know exactly how to make sense of them or how to fit them into some larger picture. So we're lucky tonight to have one of the world's experts on the Asian Pacific here to talk to us about it. So tonight's talk is co-sponsored by the George Washington Forum and the Contemporary History Institute. And I need to begin by thanking the CHI's director, Ingo Trauschweitzer, for helping to make this event possible. Appreciate the support. The Washington Forum, the other co-sponsor, is a civic education initiative which aims not just to promote viewpoint diversity here at OU, but to provide a forum where sometimes contentious subjects can be discussed and debated in a reasoned and reasonable way. And tonight's event, like all Washington Forum event, is not made possible by public funds, but by the generous donations of OU alumni and staff, and by grants from private foundations, including in this instance, a grant from the Thomas W. Smith Foundation and from the Jack Miller Center. And I want to thank them for helping bring Michael Green to Athens. Michael Green teaches at Georgetown University, where he's Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic International Studies and Director of Asian Studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He did his undergraduate work here in Ohio at Kenyon College and got both his MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Before starting at Georgetown, he served on the staff of the National Security Council, as a senior fellow of East Asian Security at the Council on Foreign Relations, as an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins, and as a senior advisor on Asia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. His most recent book is By More Than Providence, Grand Strategy and American Power in the Asia Pacific Before 1783. I hope you'll join with me in welcoming Michael Green here to OU.
Thank you, Professor Ingram. I wasn't sure where to come in, so I came down the aisle like the bride. This is a great hall. I'm delighted to be here. In the middle of August, I was driving down the Pacific Coast Highway with my family, which I highly recommend if you haven't done it. And we like to listen to books on tapes. And so I downloaded David McCullough's book, The Pioneers, because I thought it was about the pioneers going on the Oregon Trail to the West Coast, but actually it's about the pioneers going to Southeast Ohio. And it's a great book, and the last part of the book is about how Ohio University is chartered in 1787 and formed in 1804. And when they chartered Ohio University, if you've read the book, that's when they knew they were going to be okay. There was going to actually be civilization in Ohio and a future. And then McCullough describes how beautiful Ohio University is, but he describes it in 1804. And then, like, literally that night, I got an email from Professor Ingram inviting me to come here and do the speech. And I said, my God, this is like, it's ordained, so I had to come. It's nice to get out of the swamp, or what President Obama called the blob. I was born in Washington. My parents were government officials, but I went to Kenyon in Gambier, Ohio for 4 years, and it's really nice to escape the madness that is Washington right now, and hopefully go for 90 minutes without talking about impeachment, although if you want to ask about it, you can. So I'm going to talk about Asia, and I'm going to talk about Asia in pretty broad terms so that you can ask questions about anything that's on your mind in the region. I was President George W. Bush's main advisor on Asia. I covered everything from Afghanistan to Hawaii. All of that region is fair game. If you ask me about Brexit or Russia, I may not be able to answer, but if it's in the Asia, Indo-Pacific, I'll do my best. And I'm going to talk about history, and in particular about the topic of my last book, The American Role in Asia, which is indispensable. If you're in Canberra, Australia, if you're in Tokyo, Japan, if you're in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, where I spent last summer, you hope that people in Athens, Ohio care about you. And you hope that people in Athens, Ohio care about America's role in Asia, because we have been for 70 plus years the indispensable pillar for peace, prosperity, and stability. We've made some very big mistakes, which we can talk about. But in general, the most prosperous, peaceful period Asia has known in centuries has been because of the United States. We're less powerful than we were. That's the bad news. The good news is we have some pretty good friends and allies in the region. A few years before Ohio University was chartered, when the frontier was Ohio, in 1783, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to George Rogers Clark, who was in command of the Continental forces on the frontier at the very end of the American Revolution. And in the letter, he told Colonel Clark that our spies in London, and I understand that Professor Ingram every year brings spies from Ohio University to London, which sounds pretty fun. But Jefferson told Clark in this letter, our spies in London tell us that the British are raising money to send an expedition across Canada to find a passage to the Pacific Northwest. And when this war is over and we've won our independence, we have to get to 1983. And of course, when Jefferson's president, he charters the Lewis and Clark expedition, which is famous for seeking passage to the Pacific Northwest, famous for biological and exploratory science. But in Jefferson's mind, the Pacific Northwest, what's today Oregon and Washington State, was not just about creating a republic that was free from coast to coast, an empire of liberty, as some of the founding fathers called it. Jefferson also had in his mind the Pacific. Jefferson, Washington, Robert Morris, the banker for the Continental Army, Philadelphia merchant, they all knew about Asia. They knew about the sea otter pelts that were taken off of what is today Oregon and sold for huge profits to the Hong merchants in Canton, what's now Guangzhou, or how merchants took sandalwood in the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, and sold it also for huge profits, or ginseng, which grew, they knew, in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, although no American merchant had ever sold to China because the British did that. But when we were independent, Jefferson, Morris, Washington knew that part of our commerce would be with the Pacific. It's even in the Federalist Papers, for the American historians in the room, if you look in the Federalist Papers, you will find references by John Jay to trade with Canton and China as one of the reasons we needed a federal form of government republic. How did Jefferson know about this? Has anyone, if you've been to historic colonial Williamsburg, which reenacts the capital of Virginia in the 1770s, they have Chinese pottery. I took a group of Chinese scholars to Williamsburg for a conference, and we had lunch in a pub, and a Thomas Jefferson reenactor came out, and this prominent professor from Beida, Beijing University, said, "You don't know who I am?" And he said, "Why, you're from China, sir." And he had done his homework. Jefferson knew quite a bit about China. One reason Jefferson knew about China in 1783 was because there was an American named John Ledyard, a Dartmouth student. He dropped out his sophomore year. Don't anyone do this. Don't try this at home. But he dropped out. He chopped down a birch tree, carved a canoe, paddled down the Connecticut River, joined the Royal Marines in the 1770s, and was assigned to Captain Cook's flagship and traveled around the Pacific with Captain Cook. And then when the American Revolution broke out, he deserted in Boston, and he went to the founding fathers and told them our futures in the Pacific. So I reference all of this because 1783 is the first piece of archival evidence that even before the United States was an independent republic, leaders, a small handful of white slave-owning leaders, to be sure, but leaders of the new republic thought about a future that involved the Pacific, Canton, China, the Pacific Northwest, the Sandwich Islands. It was not the most important thing, but it was in their mind, and they were determined not to let anyone keep us out. And so Jefferson was worried about the British, and we stared down the British. The British in the War of 1812 took the Pacific Northwest, which was an American outpost. And in the Treaty of Ghent, John Quincy Adams took it back. In 1841, President Tyler gave a speech, Tyler of Virginia, gave a speech, his State of the Union speech, where he announced that the Monroe Doctrine would extend to Hawaii, that Hawaii would be American, that no British or French colonies would be allowed, even though we were not powerful enough to do anything about it. In the 1890s, we stood down the Germans, who were an emerging power. In World War II, we stood down the Japanese. In the Cold War, the Soviets. So this 1783 date is important because the US has a long history of making certain that the Pacific Ocean is a conduit for American trade, for American values, especially missionaries, and for American security to be as far west as possible, and not for the Pacific Ocean to become a conduit for security threats to come to the West Coast or block us from our trade or block us from expanding our values. And that has been, I would argue, an imperfect but consistent American theme. And it matters today because in Washington today, in the foreign policy debates, the number one theme right now is not terrorism, which is what it was when I was in the White House with President Bush. It's not climate change. It's China. It's strategic competition with China. The Trump administration in 2017 published the White House National Security Strategy, and I worked on those for President Bush. And it states what is our national strategy in the world. And this one said that the top priority for the United States is strategic competition with China and Russia. But the real focus was China. That the biggest threat to the US in the long run ultimately is China. It's not just the Trump administration. There is bipartisan consensus in the Congress. The National Defense Authorization Act, the defense budget bill, if you've ever read legislation, it has the whereas, on a bipartisan basis, whereas China is increasing its military power, stealing technology, intimidating smaller states. Democrats and Republicans both agreed. Senate Foreign Relations Committee for Foreign Policy passed an act which had the whereas, which is also premised on the need for the US to compete with China. It's more of a Washington thing. It's more of an inside the Beltway thing. It's an 80-90% consensus in the Congress, in think tanks, in the administration, that China's our next big challenge. In public opinion polls outside of the Beltway, outside of Washington, people are less worked up about China. The polls show that a majority of Americans think China is an adversary, but a majority of Americans think China is not a threat. So most of America outside of Washington is much more chill about China. But in Washington, it is the leading debate right now. Actually, that's not accurate. The leading debate right now is impeachment, but in foreign policy, it's the leading debate, and it's not a partisan debate. There's pretty broad consensus among Democrats and Republicans. So what I want to spend a few minutes talking about to set the stage for your questions is what does this strategic competition with China look like? Because it's here. The next administration, whether it's Buttigieg, Warren, Trump, this is going to be a key part of their foreign policy. Did I drop anybody's favorite candidate? I'm sorry. Kamala Harris, who did I miss? Jeb Bush. He was my guy. It doesn't matter. It's a bipartisan issue in many ways. And we're entering into an era of strategic competition. Some people in Washington talk about it like the Cold War, like the way people talked about the competition with the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, early 1950s. There's a lot of hyperbole. There's a lot of chest thumping. There's a lot of worry about what China is doing. There's not yet a lot of wisdom. And over the coming years, I think you'll see more and more of a debate about not just should we compete with China, because there's a consensus we should compete with China. Stealing of intellectual property rights, Huawei and 5G, which I'll talk about in a minute, and Chinese monopolistic behavior, human rights problems in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, intimidation of smaller states like the Philippines or Vietnam or Mongolia, and of course Taiwan, which is not in US policy an independent state, but de facto is. The enormous buildup of the People's Liberation Army, anti-satellite missiles designed to shoot down American satellites in space, speeches from Xi Jinping proclaiming China as the leading power in the world in the future. Across the board, there's a very strong sense that we've been complacent and we have to step up. But what that looks like, that's the debate that happens now. And I think there are 5 questions which we as a country are going to have to answer. And we're going to have to answer them with our allies because we're not strong enough to do this alone. So I want to go through those 5 questions, and they'll touch on some of the key issues in Asia today and in U.S.-China relations. The first question we have to answer is, what is our assumption? What do we think are the sources of Chinese behavior? When George Kennan wrote his famous long telegram warning and advising how the United States, he wrote it from Moscow, should deal with the Soviet Union after World War II, essentially predicting the Cold War. It focused on the sources of Soviet behavior. So the first question is, what are the sources of Chinese behavior? What is China's intent? Where does this come from? One way to look at this is, how did we get surprised? Washington, D.C., Republican and Democratic administrations did not anticipate the difficulty with China we're having today. So one question we have to answer is, what did we get wrong? Was China from the beginning a problem and we were just too soft, or did something else happen? I think there are 3 explanations. It doesn't necessarily tell us what we should do, but it puts it in context. I don't think that the Bush administration I worked for, or the Obama administration, or the Clinton administration, or any administration going back to Richard Nixon, the first president to open up to Mao Zedong in 1971 and open up to communist China, I don't think any of those administrations got China wrong or was completely naive. I think things changed. And if you study history, you'll recognize some of these factors. And there are 3. One is structure. China is just much more powerful. I worked in the Pentagon in the mid-1990s, right out of school, and there was a major crisis in the Taiwan Straits. China bracketed Taiwan with ballistic missiles, did major military exercises, intimidated Taiwan, but also intimidated Japan, Singapore, other countries. It was the first time since the US and China had opened up dialogue and then diplomatic relations. It was the first time that China had used military force to significantly intimidate American friends and allies. The missiles that fell around Taiwan landed in Japan's sea lanes and Korea's sea lanes. And the Pentagon and the Clinton administration at the time in 1995, 96, felt that it had to respond. So what did we do? We sent 2 US carrier battle groups, aircraft carriers and all the cruisers and destroyers and frigates, 2 of them, through the South China Sea, the first island chain, from Japan down past Taiwan, in between the Philippines and China to Singapore. Right by Hainan Island, where China had its major naval base, and we just took our time, 1 week apart, 2 carrier battle groups, and there was nothing the Chinese could do. We basically outflanked them to the south of Taiwan, and there was nothing they could do. Today, we couldn't do that. China has built 3 artificial islands in the South China Sea that are like aircraft carriers that can carry, bigger than aircraft carriers, can carry bombers and fighters. The PLA Navy is on a path to be larger than the US Navy and the Japanese Navy combined. And if we were to send aircraft carriers back into the South China Sea to sort of pressure China not to intimidate Taiwan, they would be surrounded by Chinese submarines, ballistic missiles designed to destroy aircraft carriers, frigates, destroyers, 5th generation stealth fighters. So the first thing that has changed is what political scientists would call structure, just or scale. The size of China's power is enormous. That's the reality. But that's not all that's changed. The other thing is contingency, things people didn't anticipate. Historians understand how important contingency is. In 2008, 2009, when a major financial crisis struck the US and most economies, it had a profound impact on Chinese thinking. For one thing, it suggested to Xi Jinping, the emerging leader, who in 2008 was chosen as China's vice president. I remember driving in the car in Washington with my kids, who were pretty small then, and listening to NPR, and the announcer, and Xi Jinping came to Washington, And the announcer said, Xi Jinping, the powerful new Chinese vice president, is in Washington. Xi Jinping, a leader in the Chinese Communist Party, his father was a famous guerrilla. And then in the Chinese Civil War, he said, his father was a famous Chinese guerrilla. And my 4-year-old son goes, his daddy was a guerrilla? And my wife, without missing a beat, said, your daddy's a monkey. But Xi Jinping came to power on the back of the financial crisis, which was devastating, and took away two conclusions. Number one, the Anglo-American capitalist model that we have been converging towards, it's not so great. It's not so great. They're not so tall. China's model has a lot to offer. And then the second thing was, we don't want too much reform and opening. Chinese leaders since Deng Xiaoping had been engaged in reform and opening, which made US-China relations hopeful because of the convergence of our economic and maybe our political systems. But Xi Jinping looked at the financial crisis and said, no, we are not going to go down that path of capitalism running amok. The Chinese Communist Party will lose control. So what he did was he reversed reform and opening. He expanded the role of state-owned enterprises run by former PLA generals and the Communist Party. They then became powerful voices in the Standing Committee of the Politburo, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, and they became strong advocates of not opening and reforming and very nationalistic, protectionist. And so a constituency was built into Chinese political thought to oppose the US, to oppose reform and opening. And the rest of it you can see in the political crackdown in China. I would argue that was in large part contingency. It was the financial crisis, it was the unexpected effect and shock that had. And then the third thing is agency. I teach a course at Georgetown on Asian leaders because I'm a political scientist, and political scientists don't know what to do with leaders. You can't measure them, can't quantify them, can't add numbers to them. They're all different, they're all quirky. You know, only historians can do leaders, and so political scientists just take them out of the equation. But leaders matter, agency matters, and the character of leaders and the experience of leaders matters. And a lot of China experts misread Xi Jinping. They thought that because his father had been purged in the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, that Xi Jinping himself, and Xi Jinping was also sent down on the farm out of Beijing and punished, forced to work, I think in his case, in a pig farm. People thought, well, he would be very opposed to communist dictatorship because of that experience, but it was the opposite. It turns out what very, very few China scholars realized was Xi Jinping's lesson from that experience was never lose power. It was a Leninist lesson, maintain control, crack down on your opponents, strangle them early. So we have, because of structure, contingency, and agency, a China that is pretty tough. And you just need to look at Xinjiang or Hong Kong to see that that's the case. Does that mean that China is now on a trajectory that we can't affect? That it's like the Soviet Union at the beginning of the Cold War, or Japan in the 1930s, or Germany in the 1930s? I don't think so. I don't think so. But it is a harder problem. Second question we have to understand is, what are China's objectives? Those flow from what I just discussed, but what can we make of China's objectives? The national security strategy of the Trump administration argues that China is a revisionist power, wants to change the rules, wants to break American leadership everywhere. I'm not sure that's 100% right. And history is a useful guide. China is a rising power. We've had rising powers before in the last few hundred years. What rising powers do is not immediately seek global domination. What other countries were rising powers? The United States of America. When we were a rising power in the 19th century, did we immediately seek global leadership? No. We were complete free riders. We let the British, we let the Royal Navy keep the sea lanes open and trade open and the trading system, and then we were free riders globally, but in the Western Hemisphere, we were revisionist. We used our rising power to push aside smaller powers and dominate the Western Hemisphere. And if you don't believe that, ask Mexico or any Central American country. Don't ask Canada, because we tried 3 times to invade Canada, and the The Canadians beat us every time. I don't know if you're Canadian, you study that. If you're American, you don't study it. We tried to invade Canada 3 times, and it went badly every time. It's kind of like hockey or I don't know what. So I think China is like us. Japan was like that. Japan allied with Great Britain in 1902, free riding globally, but within Asia, if you ask Koreans, Manchurians, Japan pushed around Asia. Bismarck's Germany did not challenge Britain, but challenged continental European powers and created the German state. So I think China's more in that mode, which means that China will flex its muscle globally, but where it's really focusing its efforts is revisionism, changing the rules, changing the order in Asia. And how do you do that if you're China? Well, the Americans are the strongest power in Asia. The core of our strength, the center of gravity, as the German strategist Clausewitz would call it, is our alliance network. With Japan, we have treaty allies, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Philippines, Thailand. We have strong partners like Singapore and India. That's our center of gravity. That's our strength. So if you're China and you want to weaken the US and Asia, that's what you go after. And Xi Jinping gave a speech in 2014 calling on Asians to settle security without outside blocs, which means without the United States. The Chinese have put enormous pressure on South Korea and other allies not to cooperate with the US, which I can go into if you're interested. That's where our problem is in Asia. We don't have to fight with China in the Middle East. We might even be able to cooperate with China in the Middle East or on global challenges like climate change. But in Asia, that's where China is flexing its muscle the most. So that raises the third question we have to figure out if we're going to have a good strategy, which is where are America's allies and partners? Where is India, Japan, Korea, Australia? Where are the Europeans? The Chinese scholars argue that the world after the Cold War developed into what they call, or international relations scholars call, multipolarity. That the Cold War was bipolar, tripolar, the US, the Soviets, China, Third World. The early post-Cold War in the 90s was unipolar, America was the dominant power, and the Chinese argued beginning in the 90s, scholars, diplomats, that the world was moving towards multipolarity. So Europe was one pole, and America was one pole. And in Asia, China was the pole. China spoke for Asia. And the Chinese view was that China should be the most important power in Asia, and the Chinese assumption initially was that Europe and the US would be would increasingly drift apart. That was the Chinese hope. But they've missed something very important, which is within Asia, there's a kind of multipolarity. China may argue that it's the most important country in Asia, in many ways it is, but there's some pretty ambitious, pretty strong countries in Asia that do not want China to be the leading power. I've done opinion surveys of elites in 10 Asian countries. None of them want China to be the leading country. None of them. And so a multipolar Asia, not a unipolar US-dominated Asia, but a multipolar Asia is one in which Japan, especially, but also India, Australia, Korea, Indonesia, have their own ambitions. And their ambitions are not to be dominated by China. They don't want to be dominated by the US, but in the surveys we've done, they'd, on balance, rather have the US continue to lead than have China take over. So we need to pay very, very close attention to where these other countries are. In general, Japan began competing with China long before we did. Yeah, there's only one country other than China in Asia. I know Vietnam briefly had an emperor, but there's only one country in Asia other than China that has had an emperor consistently since the 7th century, and it's Japan. Character Tien, emperor. And the Japanese created an emperor to make it clear to the Chinese that they were equal, even though in the 7th century Japan was not China's equal. So Japan is closely aligned with the US, is working with Australia and India to try to prevent Chinese hegemony. Australia and New Zealand trade more with China than with the US, but in recent years, because of China's behavior, have started strengthening their defense cooperation with Japan and the US, have passed laws banning Chinese companies like Huawei from entering their marketplace. Southeast Asia is a mosaic. The countries in Southeast Asia don't want to have to choose. between the US and China, so they try to position themselves. Vietnam is probably the most wary of China because of 3,000 years of fighting with China. You know how Vietnam is shaped, kind of like this? In Hanoi, they say it's from 3,000 years of China sitting on its back, that they're shaped like this. But Vietnam's not going to be a US ally. They have a socialist system, communist form of government. They need the US to counterbalance China, but they don't want to democratize either. And that's sort of a microcosm. I can go through more of Southeast Asia if you like, but every Southeast Asian country is positioning itself to maintain as much independence as possible. But none of them, not even small Cambodia or Laos, which are the most dominated by China, want to have a world in which they have no choice, in which China is the only master in the region. Therein lies some very subtle diplomatic opportunities for the US. If we train diplomats and scholars and business people who speak Lao and Cambodian and Vietnamese and know how to engage these countries. Our strategy should be to help them succeed. If they succeed, then we win, because they won't be dominated by China. We don't have to dominate them, we just don't want them to be dominated by China. Europe, transatlantic relations are bad. We fight with the Europeans about everything these days. But the European Union put out a paper in March about China, in which the European states said, we need to cooperate with China on climate change, on trade, but we are entering into a systemic competition with China about the nature of international order, the nature of human rights, democracy, and rules. So we fight with the Europeans a lot, but the Europeans are trending in a direction where there's much more awareness of China's role. I worry a lot about South Korea. American public opinion support for the US alliance with Korea. We have 28,000 troops in Korea. American public opinion support for Korea is pretty good. When Americans are asked, should we defend Korea if it's attacked, close to 2/3 say yes. And if South Korea gets attacked, it's going to get attacked by North Korea, which has nuclear weapons. So this is not like a afternoon stroll in the park. This is potentially the worst war we've seen ever. Do Americans know that? I don't know. Maybe. But in public opinion polls, and I've looked at Gallup and public opinion polls throughout history on our alliances in Asia, that's a very high number where 2/3 of Americans say no. South Korea's an ally, we should defend them. And South Koreans also are very pro-US alliance on the whole. About 2/3 also support keeping US bases. But the US-Korea alliance right now is in really bad shape. President Trump has demanded, we have 28,000 troops, the Koreans pay us about $1 billion a year to help maintain them. President Trump has demanded that they increase that 5 times by December. And so this is not what you do if you're trying to form a team. You don't form a posse because you're unsure about China at the end of the road, and you don't want to shoot China, you don't want to get in a shooting war, but you want to go down there with your posse and say, China, you got to stop drinking, you got to stop throwing beer bottles out the wall, you got to stop shooting into the street, you got to give us your gun, you got to behave. You form a posse, but you don't form the posse and then start shooting at the members of your posse, which is kind of what we're doing to South Korea and even Japan, which also is under huge pressure from President Trump to increase threefold the amount of money they pay. Bottom line is, these important countries in Asia deserve a lot of attention from the US, and I hope a lot of you are studying Hindi or Japanese or Korean or Vietnamese, because it's not all about China. And if we're going to successfully work with China to prevent China's bad behavior and move towards more cooperative relations and actually get some things done on climate change or terrorism in North Korea, we're going to need to demonstrate clearly to the Chinese that Asia is multipolar. There are other very important countries, and those other countries want China to follow the rules. But to do that, we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to these countries and think through how we help them succeed, not just how we extort them for more money. One of the things our allies and partners are doing is taking a much stricter look at their economic relations with China. Almost all the countries I just mentioned trade more with China than the US does. And, trade more with China than they do with the US. That's a little misleading because, trade now, your iPhone is not like made in China and shipped to the US. The components come from all over the Pacific Rim. The semiconductors are Japanese, the design and materials are Korean, The software is from Apple in the West Coast. The manufacturing is in China. And the reason so many countries trade so much with China is in part because it's part of a whole supply chain. It's not like the 17th century where it's just two-way trade. So it's complicated, but the bottom line is Japan, Korea, Australia, they trade more with China than they do with us. So they are looking at ways to protect themselves from Chinese intellectual property theft, stealing technology, but they don't want to completely decouple. Decoupling is a phrase you hear a lot these days in U.S.-China relations. Should we decouple from the Chinese economy? Close to 15% of our trade is with China. We decoupled from the Soviet Union, but we never had even 1% of our trade with the Soviet Union. Decoupling from a country, it's pretty tough. Talk to soybean farmers down the street about decoupling from China, or the Chamber of Commerce, or Apple or Google. It's pretty tough. So the fourth question we have to figure out is, where is the line for decoupling? The Trump administration has determined that Chinese telecom companies like Huawei cannot enter the U.S. You all know what 5G is, right? Cannot enter the 5G market in the U.S. Can't do it. Not just the U.S. Australia, Japan, Vietnam, Mongolia, the Netherlands. Britain is debating this. Germany is debating this. India is debating it. But you add up the U.S., Japan, Australia, and the other countries that have banned Huawei, and it's 40% of the world's telecommunications market. But what those countries have not agreed to is two completely different operating systems. So the Trump administration has said, not only are we banning Huawei from entering our 5G market, but we're putting Huawei on what's called the entities list, export controls. So Google and Microsoft cannot share technology with Huawei now. And what that means is, when Huawei develops its next handset, I think Huawei uses Android, but Huawei will have to develop its own operating system, which we probably don't want. Because then we have a world where 40, 50, maybe 60% of the world's market is Android or iOS based, probably with a new 5G system, which is some combination of Samsung and Nokia or Ericsson. And then the other half of the world is Huawei and a different operating system. And that's bad. And the Japanese, Australians, and others who are with us in banning Huawei from coming into the market for infrastructure, for a lot of reasons we could talk about, are not so sure about pushing China to create its own operating system. And it's bad because, for two reasons really. If you're a historian and you look back at the 1930s and look at how protectionism and closed markets and separate trading blocks fueled autarky and ultimately war, it's bad. You do not want the world breaking into economic blocks. But it's also bad because 5G is critical for the Internet of Things. So in 5 or 10 years, those windows will have devices in them that are going to be invisible almost, that can sense the temperature and change the heat, and then report that to a central mechanism somewhere on campus. And the reason that's possible, is a lot of you probably know, is that with 5G, the latency goes down, the speed goes up. But if you have two operating systems that are totally separate, you lose that latency. You lose all the benefits of a global. So if you guys want a good job prospect, one of the leading jobs now for my students is going into McKinsey or Accenture and helping US multinationals figure out how to manage a world with an Internet of Things and 5G that's two worlds, where they have to have one strategy for the China space and one strategy for the Japan, America, Canadian, Australian space. That's probably too much decoupling, but we've got to figure that out. And there are other examples too we can go into. Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure, banking. And then the last question we have to figure out, and then I'll stop, is, are we in an ideological war with China? We're a democracy. China is a communist dictatorship. That dictatorship is maybe too strong. Authoritarian regime. But we have different values. And those values the differences are becoming more pronounced in the digital age because data is now very, very important to civil liberties. And under Chinese law, Chinese companies have to turn over all data to the Ministry of State Security, to the Chinese government. And that's scared people. We're in an era where our values are different because of the NBA. If one guy tweets something criticizing or for supporting Hong Kong and the NBA can be shut down in China, then questions that 20 years ago might have been not national questions are suddenly national questions. So it's sort of the flip side of globalization and data moving around the world. The flip side of that is people in open societies feel a lot more sensitive to violations of their privacy, their right of free speech. But in China, the government also feels much more sensitive about data flowing into China and is trying to protect themselves. So the era of data that we're moving into actually is exacerbating the sense of ideology. But I don't think China is an ideological foe like the Soviet Union. So I was a student in the 1980s, and I ran the Kenyon College radio station, WKCO. I would ask if anyone listens, but I don't think it comes this far. And every week in the 80s, I got a reel-to-reel tape from Radio Moscow. And then, once every other month, the Young Spartacus League, which was paid for by the Soviets, it was mostly Ohio State students, they would come around and, talk about how great communism was and how great Brezhnev was. And it was a propaganda campaign. It was ridiculous, but Radio Moscow tapes were they were encouraging poor radio stations, college radio stations in those days, to play their tapes, because if you used UPI ticker tape, it was expensive, but the Soviets would give you free news. It was a kind of an ideological political warfare campaign. China's not really doing that. There are debates about the so-called United Front activities in campuses, but the issue is not, in my view, that China has this messianic Bolshevik worldview to communize the entire world. Chinese don't think in those terms. China's a big country. Chinese scholars don't think that Cambodia and Pakistan should become like China. Frankly, they don't think they can become like China. So it's not that kind of ideological competition, but there is definitely an increasingly pronounced ideational, what I would call ideational competition. And especially in the question of how states govern themselves. China's giving a lot of aid under the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Developing countries need a lot of infrastructure. China's offering a lot of aid. That's a good thing at the first order of business. But it's being done in some countries in the shadows. So in Sri Lanka, China got the previous government to agree to a loan that Sri Lanka can't repay, and they built this huge port called Hanbantota. And then when the new Cambodian government got elected and came in and said, we don't want to do this deal, the Chinese said, no, you can't afford this deal, so you have only one choice, because the deal you signed allows us to determine all of these disputes in Chinese courts, so your only choice is to sign a 99-year lease letting China have this port of Hanbantota. 99 years is the lease that the British demanded of China for Hong Kong. So no coincidence, comrade. And there are a lot of studies suggesting that the PLA will now use that as a base, a military base. So this happened because corruption in Sri Lanka, because civil society couldn't act in Sri Lanka. In fact, the government at the time was shutting down NGOs and civil society. So part of the game we're in with China right now is to shine the light, to turn on the light. It's good if China wants to provide infrastructure assistance to developing countries. It's bad if it's done in a way where they're bribing people, building military bases, creating what are called debt traps so the countries can't pay them back, and then China owns the infrastructure. How do you prevent that? Part of it is we have to give infrastructure, but there's a lot of demand for infrastructure. So the best way is to make sure that these states, whether it's Sri Lanka or the Philippines, that they can make wise decisions. And a lot of that is about supporting a free press, civil society, functioning parliaments, shining a light. This is not a new American idea. Thomas Jefferson, in 1783, thought about the Pacific and the Pacific Northwest, and he later wrote that when we do arrive in the Pacific Northwest, we're not going to have colonies like the British or the French or the Spanish or the Russians, because we just decolonized ourselves, so we're not going to have colonies. But we don't know how to make states yet. They didn't know yet how to have new states join the Union. So he said, what we want in the Pacific Northwest are independent republics that are well-regulated, well-governed, and therefore resilient against imperialism, who will be able to resist Russian or British imperialism. And of course, being democratic republics will be naturally aligned with us. You know who else said that? Commodore Matthew Perry. After he opened Japan in 1853, he came in, he gave a series of speeches in New York and Philadelphia and Boston saying in the 1850s, we should not Christianize Japan. We should encourage Japan to be an independent country, and if Japan is successful and becomes a republic, it will be a model for other Asian states. Alfred Thayer Mahan, the famous American strategist, naval officer at the end of the 19th century, argued that too. Ronald Reagan argued that. Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton argued that. The US does well in Asia when we're on the side of nationalism, when we support states succeeding and resisting imperialism. And that's, in a sense, an ideological game, if not a conflict. When we're on the wrong side of nationalism, we usually don't do well. Vietnam War. The beginning of World War II, when the Japanese were winning, American OSS, intelligence officers, military officers sent warnings back from Burma, eastern part of India, Malaya, saying, Japan is more popular than we are. Japan is more popular than we are because Japan is claiming that it is against imperialism. And we are fighting this war in 1942 allied with Britain and France, the imperial powers. And so eventually we won that war thanks to the US Navy, Marine Corps, and the Army, but also because the Japanese became pretty bad imperial powers. They ended up being quite brutal. But I give it as an example because historically in Asia, when we are on the side of imperialism, we lose. But when we're on the side of helping states establish themselves, we win. And states will be more resilient and more able to resist the pernicious Chinese behavior when they are resilient, which means civil societies are strong, parliaments are strong, women are empowered. Ultimately, I think, and I'll conclude with this, we're in a strategic competition with China, but it's not like the Soviet Union. I don't think we can have a successful strategic competition that's aimed at the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party. I think ultimately our strategic goal, and in any strategy you have to know what your goal is. How do you win? If we're in a competition, what does victory look like? And I would argue, but it's up for debate, winning is that China gets back on the path of reform and opening. China gets back on the path of creating wealth. Deng Xiaoping brought 500 million Chinese out of poverty. That's a good thing for the world. But to get China back on that path where it is a constructive, productive partner on issues will take time. We're going to have to compete, push back, work with allies, strengthen the US Navy, support democracy and civil society. We're going to have to compete. But ultimately, if we do it well, if countries in the region are empowered, that's going to put a lot of pressure from China, not from the US, but from the rest of the world, to start thinking through its own interests. There are still reformers in China who want opening. There's still reformers in China who know that to grow economically, China has to get out of the so-called middle income trap and create a knowledge-based economy. They're still there. We're not going to be able to tap into them under Xi Jinping for 3, 5, 10 years. We're going to have to compete. We are in an era of strategic competition, but if we're smart about it, I personally am pretty optimistic that we, somewhere down the road, will be able to get, potentially, back on a path with China that is much more productive. It's better for the Chinese people, and it's better for countries in Asia and Europe and Africa that will benefit from China's enormous wealth creation. China has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's not a bad story on the whole, but we're going to have to really get our game up. So I'll end there. Happy to take questions about any time period or any region I talked about, or the history of Ohio University. Thank you. Do people raise their hand and I call on them? Okay. Or do I just call on them? Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the between Adam Silver. I mean, if you had been able to meet with Adam Silver before his initial speech and stuff, what would you have advised to do? How did you see all that going down? Just be curious.
Basketball is the most popular sport in China. And the NBA presence in China is huge. And pretty soon they'll make more money in China than they do in the US. And it's not just the NBA, the other industry like that is Hollywood. So when Hollywood produces a big blockbuster movie, they will sometimes make more money in China than in the US, especially if it's if it's a love story or a historical drama, they won't make money in China. But if it's a high-tech, robots fighting each other kind of movie, they'll make at least as much money in China these days. And that gives China Beijing enormous leverage to intimidate the NBA or Hollywood about the content of their product. And it's really only happened in the past few years. And so I think what happened with the NBA and with Silver was when this whole thing broke, his political consultants were advising him on how to keep the Chinese market safe and happy. And I know this for a fact, actually, because I know his political consultants. He did not have political consultants who said, the US Congress is going to be really pissed off about you somehow preventing free speech. And they've learned their lesson. And I think Silber's initial statements were pretty weak, but he's gone on ESPN and he's found his bearings a little bit better. Because I'm in Washington, I get asked to brief members of Congress and testify a lot. And recently, that's the number one question I get is the NBA. And as Professor Ingram pointed out to me in the car, I think it was you who told me this, I'd forgotten, but Ted, what's the name, the senator from Texas, conservative Republican, Ted Cruz and AOC both signed a letter. So the Chinese have managed to get the most extreme wings of American politics to come together around this issue. And so for American companies, it's very hard to navigate because the reputational risk to them of dealing with China in the wrong way back in the US is starting to dawn on them. They were primarily thinking about the reputational risk to them in China. And that's not going to work because the US media, the Congress, and increasingly public opinion is concerned about what China's doing to free speech. There are lots of other examples. A certain American company had an employee who praised the Dalai Lama, and Beijing considers Tibet considers Tibet part of China and the Dalai Lama a secessionist splittist. And the Chinese got that company to reprimand the employee for praising the Dalai Lama on a company email. China declared an air defense identification zone over waters in North Pacific that Japan and Korea also claim, and demanded that airlines register for permission with them before flying through there, and United and American and Delta all did. They had to because their lawyers told them there's a 0.1% chance the Chinese will shoot you down if you don't, and as your lawyers were telling you, don't take that risk. And there are other examples. Cathay Pacific, the Hong Kong-based airline, the head of it was forced to resign because some of his, a publicly listed trading company, the Chinese government forced him to resign because some of his employees were protesting on the street in Hong Kong. So this is going to be a thing we see more and more of. The Congress, the US Congress, and other parliaments in Europe or Canada are going to punish companies that toe Beijing's line, but the companies are going to be in a really difficult. So this is another great employment prospect. This is the other thing a lot of my graduates from Georgetown are doing is they're going into political risk because for US companies operating in China now, reputationally also it's so complicated. Yeah. So it's extremely complicated. It's a very simple moral problem. The students and workers and lawyers and moms and dads who are protesting in Hong Kong are protesting because the authorities introduced legislation that would have allowed an extradition pact with Beijing that would have allowed people to be sent to China for punishment. And this was not just abstract to Hong Kong. Booksellers were seized by Chinese authorities and taken. Their families didn't know where they were. because they published books that were critical of Xi Jinping. So this is not just an abstract thing for people in Hong Kong. So the moral answer is we should support them. As a diplomatic problem, it's complicated. The last movement or big protests in Hong Kong were in 2014, the so-called umbrella movement. And the student leaders were pretty well organized. And that was a problem because the authorities knew who to arrest. And so they were able to break it up pretty easily. So this time, and some of the student leaders have come to Georgetown to speak, and they wear masks. So the people can't tell who they are. And what they say is that this time it's a much more dispersed leadership. They use social media, they use signals, paintings on the walls, so that the leadership can't be rounded up, can't be decapitated. And that's why the protests have continued, one reason. So in that sense, it's been very successful in maintaining pressure. But the downside of that is, who do the authorities negotiate with? If you don't have a leadership to negotiate with, how do you compromise? And how do the leaders, if you don't have leaders, stop violence? Because there are increasingly elements in the protests that are throwing Molotov cocktails, dropping chairs off bridges, because they're mad, or in some cases because they're thugs. It's very much the minority. The vast majority are very peaceful. So how do you control that if you don't have a centralized leadership? So to keep the protests going, no centralized leadership. But to get out of this, you need centralized leadership. But the other problem is, to get out of it, you need a leadership on the Hong Kong authority side willing to compromise. And Carrie Lam, who's the administrator, has, I think on instructions from Beijing, shown zero compromise. The student protesters have, I think, 5 demands. Some of them are complete non-starters for Beijing, like independence. But some of them are not unreasonable, like investigating police violence and things like that. And the smart thing to do would be for China, Carrie Lam will probably have to resign, to get a new leader, new face, someone braver, who goes to Beijing and says, this is not going to end well. You need to let us make some compromises. Xi Jinping doesn't want to do that. His MO is never compromise. When he meets a problem, he uses a hammer. But short of that, it's going to continually devolve into more and more violence. So that's the complicated puzzle. So then the question is, what does the US do? Number one, we need to speak out more than we have. The Congress has been fine. The Human Rights and Democracy Act, which Senator Rubio and others, Democrats and Republicans, have introduced, it's pretty tough. It would allow sanctions and other things, but only if the president chooses to use it. So it's kind of it's a sword that hasn't been unsheathed, but I think it's probably necessary to have that sword to show we're serious. And then I think that would allow the president, and it has to be the president, can't be done by the ambassador, can't be done lower down, the president to say to Xi Jinping, you're going to have a huge problem with the United States if this continues, and if you have a problem with the US, you're going to have a problem with Europe and Canada and Australia, and Hong Kong's too important to your economy, and I can tell you right now with 100% certainty President Trump is not saying that. He's holding off on this issue to try to get a trade deal. If he did say it, or if the US president did say that and did convey that message, and frankly better done privately, let the Congress be the bad cop publicly, the president's a good cop privately, saying to Xi, look, you help me out here, help yourself out. Even if he did it, there's no guarantee Xi would compromise. But I'd still say you have to do it. And the reason is this: we may not be able to change China's policy in Hong Kong, but if the president of the United States does not stand up for democracy in Hong Kong, then Beijing is going to think, oh, maybe he's not going to stand up for democracy in Taiwan. And there's an election in Taiwan. Tsai Ing-wen will probably win. Beijing doesn't like her. They're already sending more and more military forces out of Taiwan. So, an ounce of prevention. If we don't speak up more in Hong Kong, Beijing's going to think they got more room on Taiwan. And if we don't speak up on Taiwan, then they're going to think Japan. And so, even if it doesn't change Beijing's policy, I would argue, and I wouldn't have had to tell President Bush or President Obama, that if you don't speak up clearly for democracy now, do it in a way where you consider Chinese face. It's complicated because propagandists in Beijing will say it's the dark hand, America's pushing regime change. So the president has to do a lot of this privately and has to spend time on it. But even if it doesn't work, you need to make it clear the U.S. stands for democratic partners and allies. Hong Kong's not an ally and partner, but if we don't care about democracy in Hong Kong, do we care about it in Taiwan? Do we care about it in Japan? In Australia? I mean, if China's goal is to push us out of Asia, we're not helping ourselves. Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
European assessment of China, it seems to me that the assessment, at least as you put it, was that they're a strategic threat, or at least a potential strategic threat. It does seem that that's more of a sort of Western European Atlanticist mindset, more than there were large swaths of Europe, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, even in certain cases, Italy recently, that had a much more ambivalent or even positive attitude, and sort of seeing China as less onerous as a sort of ideological partner than the United States, which might push certain values with the countries. So just sort of where do you see that going?
So it's a very complicated mosaic. At the macro level, the European Union is supposed to be representative of democratic values, from Lisbon to Poland, and should stand up for democracy at the macro level. Then you break it down state by state, and right now you find that the French are getting very tough on China because the French love to get their back up when someone steals their technology. But also, France has the largest EEZ in the South Pacific, and the Chinese are starting to come into it. And also, France has significant interests in sub-Saharan Africa. So France has it's touching a lot of neuralgia for France. The Danes, the Swedes, also a bit tougher on China. Britain is badly distracted by Brexit. The British have to make a decision on whether or not to allow Huawei in to their 5G market. At first they said they'd do it, then a parliamentary inquiry said, no, we can't do it, and then they just put the whole thing off until after Brexit. So Britain's in the timeout chair for now, which is a big problem for us, by the way. Our transatlantic coordination depends on Britain, and right now we're having to work with France, which is okay, but that's not how it normally works. Germany decided it would let the Huawei in, but now there are huge pushbacks from the Bundestag and from civil society groups. The Germans had a big wake-up call when a Chinese company bought Keukel, a major machine tool and industrial company in Germany, through another European Union country and then took the technology. So in Germany, there's a growing alarm about China, but Chancellor Merkel is weak right now. So it's hard for Germany to make decisions. So it's a real mosaic. You go to a country like Poland or Hungary, and Viktor Orban in Hungary is very pro-Beijing because he's anti-EU, and it's also not a rich country, and the Chinese are offering a lot of aid, and the authoritarian position kind of works for Viktor Orban. But within Hungarian society, there's a significant minority, 30–40%, who absolutely want to be part of the EU, hate Viktor Orban. So, even within countries, there are these divisions. The Chinese strategic view of Europe used to be in the 90s that the EU is a pole in the global multipolarity. So when Jacques Chirac and Schroeder and others were talking about American hyperpuissance, hyperpolarity, and American crazy, the Chinese use that. And Chirac painted the Eiffel Tower in the Chinese Communist flag in 2002 and stuff. After 9/11, he painted it with the American flag, but then he did the Chinese flag. And so the Chinese used to view Europe as kind of a pole to play against the Americans. Then I'd say not now, but then in the 2005 to 2017 frame, they looked at Europe as pathetic, easily divided. Now they're starting to worry a little bit about Europe because of this March 2019 statement on systemic competition, and because they can see the Europeans are starting to trend more. The one thing they have going for them is that we are treating Europe about as badly as we possibly could. We are making it really, really hard. Macron proposed to President Trump early on cooperation to deal with China's industrial espionage and technology, and this is now pretty public, I think. But the president told Macron, no, we're not going to help you with China. The EU is worse than China. And so the EU is pretty annoying. I have to give that to the president. But the Chinese are not panicked about Europe right now because we have so many fights with them over everything from climate change to trade to burden sharing. We'll see. We'll see. I think for the next president, maybe for President Trump if he gets reelected, we'll see what he thinks. There's a European card we can play, and right now we're not. Yeah.
So you talked about how the competition with China isn't really like competition with the Soviets because it lacks that ideological component. And you talked also about how we've been complacent about China in the past and how we need it to be harder against them in the future. But I think some people might argue that the reason we were able to compete as hard and successfully as we did against the Soviets was because of that ideological component. And that's kind of what was able to get American popular opinion on sides, so to speak. And you also talked about how China right now is an inside the Beltway issue, and outside the Beltway it really doesn't seem as big a deal. And I guess my question kind of is, without that ideological component, do you see this becoming an outside the Beltway issue the same way the fight against the Soviets was? Is that possible?
It's a very, very interesting question.
And I don't know if you saw the 2 speeches on China Vice President Mike Pence gave. So Pence gave 2 speeches on China that were kind of like Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. They were very, very hardline. I mean, you could almost universally replace China with Soviet Union. Very hardline. And I think, in fact, I'm told by people in his office that part of the reason he gave this very hardline speech, there were a couple reasons. One was that the hawks in the administration, and this administration is pretty unified on China, they were worried that President Trump would throw them under the bus, that he would make a deal with Xi Jinping on trade and drop everything they cared about, Taiwan, banning Huawei from 5G, human rights, everything. So one reason Vice President Pence gave that speech with President Trump's approval was to get it up as high a level as possible. Another reason he did it was because he gave the first speech right around the time Joe Biden announced, and he did the second speech more recently, but of all the Democratic candidates, Biden is clearly seen as the softest on China. And this is my own supposition, but I think part of it also was pre-positioning for the election to run on China if it's Biden. Because Biden, for those who follow China policy, Vice President Biden has many fine qualities, but one of them is not being tough on China. And the third reason, which maybe is the main reason, is people in the White House saw the public opinion polls, and they wanted to kind of wake up the American public. This is a strategic information campaign to mobilize the American public. In that way, it's kind of like the Iron Curtain speech, or speeches by John Foster Dulles in the early 50s. It's designed to get all of you to be more alarmed about China. Ultimately, what will do it, I don't think the speech will work, because I don't think most Americans want to contain China. Polls clearly show that Americans, when polls ask, how should we deal with China? And people are given a variety of, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs does the best polling on foreign affairs of the American public. And when the American public's given a variety of options, they usually choose, let's work with our allies to counterbalance China, but let's not surrender Asia to China, but let's also not contain China. Let's work with our allies to balance China. Support for alliances in the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, the Center for American Progress, Pew polling, support for alliances among Americans is really high right now. And one theory is especially among millennials, which is interesting because alliances were not part of millennials' experience. And one theory is it's because Trump attacks alliances, therefore young people are for them. Maybe, but I think there's, and that's definitely true if you watch Colbert or The Daily Show, but I think there is an inherent recognition that alliances are important. containment is not a popular option. So I think, to answer your question, I think as people learn more about Xinjiang, and more is coming out, the images of Hong Kong, the parable about the NBA, there will be a lot more stories about Hollywood and how Hollywood content is shaped by China. The military threat, what China will likely do to Taiwan after the elections, more military threat, I think that's going to move the dial. And 5 or 6 years ago, 49% of Americans said China's a partner, and 48% said China's an adversary. Pretty close. Now, a majority say China's an adversary, 50-some%. My guess is that's going to go to 60, 65%. But enemy, I think it's going to probably, not, unless China does something really, really bad, it's not going to go above 50%. So I think the dial moves, but not in the way Vice President Pence hopes. Yeah. Yeah, over here.
Sure, thank you. So you described the emergence of this bipartisan consensus in Washington, D.C. on China policy over the last 2 years. And I'm curious, in an environment like that, how do we avoid the dangers of groupthink? I mean, bipartisan consensus sounds great to those of us who are tired of hearing about hyperpartisanship, but that type of bipartisan consensus also preceded some of the most disastrous American foreign policy decisions, including the war in Vietnam.
It's so hard from Washington. We get criticized when we fight, and then when we get along, we get criticized. It's like, that's what it is. It's a very good question, and I think there is groupthink in the administration right now. When I was the senior advisor, the title was, it was a really long title, but the senior Asia person on the NSC staff for President Bush, I had, for my staff, I had one academic, I had one intelligence analyst, I had one military officer, I had 2 diplomats. And that was sort of the model we tried to follow to avoid groupthink. Because the academics will bring in fresh perspectives, new research, contacts outside of government in Asia. The military guys will understand competition, red team, blue team, alliances. The intel officers will also help you reach out into those agencies. Because when you're in the White House, you don't implement policy, you coordinate it, but you need the State Department and Defense Department to do their work. But it was to break groupthink. And I was a senior Asia person, but Condoleezza Rice, my boss, and I think this was true for Susan Rice and others in Obama, made sure that there was a mix of senior directors. So I was an academic, another guy was military, another person was a diplomat. So one way you avoid the groupthink is that. The Trump administration Asia team is very capable. They're quite good, actually, most of them. But they're all military, 100%. And the reason is when President Trump ran, internationalists, including me, who'd worked for President Bush, signed letters saying we opposed him. So academics, lawyers were like off. And military officers couldn't do that. So the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia is a very capable retired Air Force general. The Assistant Secretary for Asia Defense is a Navy. The Senior Director at the NSC is Marine. Commerce Department, military. So you absolutely want them in the mix, but I think there's a little too much groupthink because there's not enough people there's almost no academics, not surprisingly, with President Trump. The diplomats, if you're watching the impeachment, are there, but they're isolated and not trusted. So a lot of the design of policy is being done by military officers. I've taught at the National War College, and I have a lot of military in my family. What military officers do really well is make you eat your broccoli, I can tell you that. My dad was a Marine. But what military officers do extremely well is planning. Better than academics and better than diplomats. What's our objective? Like, what's the hilltop we're going to take? How do we get there? What is our equipment? Who are our allies? Excellent, excellent at it. What they don't do as well, because they don't have the experience, is diplomacy, development, democracy promotion, civil society work, considering the attitudes of societies, of underrepresented people in those societies. That's not what they're generally trained to do. And so it's a long answer to your question, but I do think there is a danger of groupthink right now, because it is The Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense are both the same class at West Point. So the military thinks strategically, thinks of objectives, but in military war games, there's blue team, red team. Winning and losing. And the strategy right now has a little too much of that flavor. And if the diplomats were more empowered, if there were some more academics, if you had more business, real business people, you'd get more of a debate. And so the answer to the question is, yeah, we're a little bit in groupthink mode right now. That's not so true with the Congress. I think the Congress is much more diverse, actually. Well, at least in terms of experience. Take another minute to answer your question. I look at who's doing Asia in the Congress right now. So Dan Sullivan, a friend of mine, worked with him, senator from Alaska, Ohioan, but he's senator from Alaska, Marine, Harvard Law School. Stephanie Murphy in the House, Vietnamese American, went to Georgetown, OSD, they all went to Georgetown, OSD, Defense. A big player in Asia right now is the chair of the Asia Subcommittee in the Senate, Cory Gardner from Colorado, local politician, local businessman. It's a pretty interesting mix. Mitt Romney is pretty active on Asia right now, business background. Ben Cardin from Maryland, my senator, liberal Democrat, local politics, very focused on human rights. It's pretty, I'd say on the Hill right now, there's a lot of people interested in Asia with interesting backgrounds. But the place to worry about, to your question, is within the administration. Yes?
How's our domestic policy directly influenced by our competition with China?
Policy or
Policy.
Oh, you mean like cuts or environmental stuff? Usually I get asked how our domestic politics influences our foreign policy, because I'm from Washington. We have no domestic policy. We don't even have a rights as a state. And you're not talking politics, you're talking policy, right? Governors, state governors are the least freaked out about China, because state governors want investment. State governors, Ohio in particular, benefited enormously from Japanese and Korean investment. Japan's the largest creator of manufacturing jobs in the US, of any overseas country, followed by Germany and Korea. So state governors want investment. Ohio has an office in Beijing and Tokyo. Here's another career idea. One of my graduates is now working for Minnesota as their Asia lead. So US states have their own little mini foreign policies and trade policies. So it complicates governors' development plans, because 3 years ago, Governor Kasich or Governor Hogan in Maryland, my governor, Chinese investment was part of their plan for development. But it's too complicated now. It's too fraught with political risk. There are too many concerns about technology theft. So last year, foreign direct investment in the US by China dropped over 90%. So if you're a state governor, it's not going to be such a great investment partner probably, and you have to completely rethink your development plans. And what are they doing? They're focusing again on Japan and Korea, a little bit more on India. If you do policy on 5G, so the federal government has said, we are banning Huawei from entering our 5G market and bidding on what's it called? Not Ray-Band, bandwidth. Anyway, because they will take all the data. So it's a fact. And they will do monopolistic behavior, low interest loans, create debt traps. So we don't want them. The problem is a lot of parts of the country, I don't know about Ohio, but Idaho, Wyoming, they already have Huawei in the 4G network. And so as a matter of domestic policy, the Federal Communications Commission, I traveled in Asia recently with the head of the Telecom Industry Association, Verizon, Sprint, AT&T, those companies. They're saying to the federal government, it's going to cost $2 billion, by the way, for us to now backfill all the infrastructure we have to replace because you say we can't use Huawei. And the federal government doesn't have an answer. So that's another example. right there. Universities, state universities, private universities, a lot of Chinese students. I'm guessing here you probably have hundreds, at least, of students from China. You want them. It's good for the economy. It's good for students who are studying China to actually have students from China in their classroom. It's a good thing. But there are growing concerns that the United Front Department of the Chinese Communist Party is recruiting students to try to keep an eye on other Chinese students. It's a very sensitive issue universities are just starting to grapple with. Congress is considering legislation to basically regulate this, which would be really bad, in my view. You don't want Congress regulating how universities recruit students and do things like that. Stephen Miller, you guys know who he is, in the White House, affectionately known by some comedians as Smeagol in a suit. Stephen Miller proposed to President Trump that all Chinese students be banned from coming to the US. And it just happened that on the day he proposed that, the US ambassador to China, Terry Branstad, who was governor of Iowa, was in Washington. And so people in the State Department and the NSC got him in to see the president to say, you know, Mr. President, if you do that, Iowa State will collapse and you will lose Iowa in the next election. So he backed off. So these are policy questions about higher education policy. I could go on and on. Given what I just said, how do we compete with China? If we're, STEM, you've got to defend basic science and math skills if we're going to create enough software engineers and engineers if we're going to compete, we have to fix our own education system. Trade policy, there's lots and lots of areas. It's, I'm kind of a free market, center-right kind of guy. I think competition can be good. When I was doing my PhD, we were panicked about Japan. And there were lots of debates like the ones we're having now with China. It was an easier problem because Japan is a democracy and an ally, and China has nuclear missiles aimed at us. Much more complicated. But the competition was good because the debate led to Congress thinking through how do we make ourselves more competitive. And that's a whole range of things, from K through 12 education to infrastructure. So it's an endless list, actually, when you start thinking about it. And a list that will maybe be improved by competition with China. Yeah.
Bringing it back to Asia, you think about, especially I'm thinking for Southeast Asia, but then also for South Asia as well. We talk about kind of inculcating, rather than telling them what to do, the U.S. telling them what to do, inculcating like a resilience within these individual countries. You're talking about, strengthening civil society and the press and democracy, but in some countries, I'm thinking of like Vietnam, but even India, this would be met with resistance, would be met as Americans coming in and telling them what to do. So I'm wondering, how if you were advising a diplomat, how would you maneuver that space?
So I'm on the board of a called the Asia Foundation, which spends about $110 million a year. It's not huge, but that's not small money either, on a couple core issues in Asia. Women's empowerment, because studies show that when women are involved in economic development, it's more sustainable. And when women are involved in conflict resolution, the peace deals stick. It's pretty clear data. Civil society building within the laws of countries. The Asia Foundation works in China and Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. Within the laws of those countries, working with the government, find ways to strengthen civil society. Because there are bureaucrats and officials in Vietnam and China who don't like it when there are protests, okay? We'll work with local civil society groups to create an ombudsman process or ways to intermediate between the government and protesters. And so that's how you do it. You put an Asian face on it. One thing my wife for a while was in charge of the women's empowerment program at the Asia Foundation. And they wouldn't, they wouldn't have somebody from New York go into a village in the south of Thailand and yell at people. Democratize, you people. They would have Koreans go to Cambodia or Thailand because Korea democratized on its own. Or they wouldn't have American women go to Indonesia and talk about women's empowerment. They'd have, Japanese or Koreans. So that's how you do it. And that's very subtle for Americans, but we're pretty good at it. And I kind of laughed when you asked the question because although I'm on the board of this foundation, most of my work is kind of high strategy, battleships, aircraft carriers, and all that stuff. And my wife actually spends long periods of time in Nepal and Cambodia and Mongolia training women in those countries to train other women, so that it's, right? So it's, when my daughter was in kindergarten, they had "What do your mommy and daddy do" day. And my daughter apparently said, "My mommy helps women and girls in Asia, so they're safe and they're okay. And my daddy, he's a professor, and I think his job is to tell Asians what to do." My wife's smarter, because that's how you do it. That's how you do it. And so, you know, if you're thinking about careers in this space, whether it's Asia or Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa, that's how you do it. And that's how with $100 and $110 million, you can empower civil society groups there. But, you know, when USAID gives food aid, they're required by Congress to put big American flags on it from the people of the United States, because Congress is worried taxpayers won't support foreign aid. So there are a lot of domestic political pressures to not be subtle. But when we're subtle, we're pretty good. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.